One of the most outspoken critics of President Trump and his team has been Vermont Congresswoman Becca Balint. We sat down with the Democrat to talk about her concerns, and we also got the Republican perspective. There are sort of two schools of thought. One, that the Democrats should be resisting, speaking up. Or two, that they could find some ways to work with the administration when appropriate. We saw Senator Welch, for example, vote to confirm the USDA Secretary Brooke Rollins, knowing that Vermont would probably have to work with the USDA. How do you think the Democrats should be comporting themselves right now?
One of the things that I always try to remind people is that I'm in the House. And in the House, we don't get to vote on nominees like that, right? And so our job is to try to figure out how do we in the minority, again, get anything done. And we have, unfortunately, not been able to find that's all it will take, 3 Republicans to partner with us on anything. And so my strategy right now has been to inform Vermonters as much as possible what is going on, the ways in which this administration is running afoul of federal law and the Constitution, and fight like hell in committee. So I was in committee last week, the Budget Committee, for 12 hours trying to save Medicaid, trying to save Social Security, because I know there's going to be a huge tax fight in March. And they want to claw some of the money away from federal programs to pay for a big tax cut for the extremely wealthy. And so, yes, sometimes you got to throw punches and you got to throw elbows. And if there are opportunities to partner, I will take them. I co-sponsored a bill with a Republican last week on a mental health bill. I have my priorities, but I'm not holding out a lot of hope that we are able to get 3 Republicans to stand against the worst impulses of this administration. We shouldn't have Republicans who are willing to give away their power of the purse, for example. That's the purview of Congress, and we just haven't seen that. And it's very disturbing to me. That
fighting spirit, of course we're not talking about literal violence, but that fighting spirit, we really saw on display here in Vermont this week. There were very vocal demonstrations in Montpelier and Burlington, people saying that they were advocating to save our democracy.
Yes.
Our Constitution's not for sale.
The Vermont GOP sees those demonstrations in an interesting way.
A different light, I'm sure, yes.
Democrats like Balint can't plan to just hold opposition rallies every 6 weeks and think things are going to get better. They have to come to the table and be willing to be part of the solution, not part of some kind of permanent activist base that's going to oppose everything that Republicans are doing.
How do you see those large-scale vocal demonstrations unfolding?
I would like to see more people paying attention and making their voices heard. You have an administration right now that is not just pushing the edge of what the executive is responsible for and what they have authority over, but they are trying to take authority away from both the legislative branch and the judicial branch. And you saw that in some of the remarks that J.D. Vance made last week, that the president actually doesn't have to have a check on his power from the judiciary. That is how the government is set up. So we're essentially playing by 2 different sets of rules. You've got people right now who believe in the separations of powers, believe in the democracy, and those who don't. So it is a very stark contrast. And I don't know how you can look at what's happening with this administration trying to pass things like jettisoning the Department of Education or taking away the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau.
We virtually shut down the out-of-control CFPB, escorting radical left bureaucrats out of the building and locking the doors behind them. What they were doing was so terrible. Where they were spending the money was so terrible. What we haven't looked at yet, but will be, is does the money come back to them? Because nobody can be stupid like that.
Both of which were set up by Congress. So Congress is the one that has to dismantle them and seizing that power for themselves. That is not the sign of a healthy democracy. And I will make one other point. The ways in which this administration is going about decimating the federal workforce is essentially to set up a system by which people are spying on each other, ratting each other out. If they are not partisans through and through. Our federal workforce is not supposed to be a partisan workforce. You're not supposed to be Democratic or Republican in the way that you do your job. You swear an allegiance to the Constitution, and you swear an oath to make sure that you are abiding by ethical rules. And so how disturbing is it right now that we have an administration that has made the federal workforce the enemy?
The people voted for major government reform. There should be no doubt about that.
We're finding tremendous fraud and tremendous abuse.
They're not the enemy. We can go after waste, fraud, and abuse without specifically eliminating positions that we need. For example, we had Trump and the Musk administration, which I like to call it because he has empowered Musk to a very scary degree. They fired people who were supposed to be watching over our nuclear arsenal and then had to scramble to try to bring them back. We've seen that in many instances. So I do worry about the democracy. I really do.
The president said, "He who works to save his country breaks no law."
That's right. That's chilling. That's chilling. And I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, or if you're someone who, sometimes swings both ways, as it were. You should be scared by any president saying, essentially, whatever I do is fine, because that is essentially what he's saying. I don't care what political party you are. That's not how things operate in a democracy.
You are one of only a few people who can say this, that your entire U.S. House district is a state.
Yes.
You represent the whole state.
Just a few of us.
Most Congress members represent a city or part of a state.
Yes.
You represent the whole state. And I point that out because that means that you represent each and every Vermonter, even the 120,000 Vermonters who voted for Donald Trump.
Absolutely.
Those folks, many of them, have been pleased to see what the president is doing around his so-called America First agenda, rooting out waste as he sees it.
Not like a little bit, billions, tens of billions of dollars. It could be close to $1 trillion that we're going to find.
How are you being mindful of the fact that you do represent Vermont Republicans at this time?
I really appreciate that question because I actually think about it all the time. Whatever beef I have with this administration is not with voters in Vermont. I don't care who you voted for. I don't care, in some ways, if you voted at all. My job is to make sure that whatever this administration does is in the best interest of Vermont and this country. And so I understand that there are people who are somewhat enamored of what Musk is trying to do or what Trump is trying to do through these executive orders in this, what I see as a complete decimation of our workforce. But I can tell you, Vermonters are going to feel the consequences from that, and it's not going to be positive. So you've got federal workers right now in Vermont who take care of Vermonters in their work, whose jobs are either have been eliminated or will be eliminated. You have right now businesses in Vermont who call me, small businesses who say, if we have a trade war with Canada, we will not survive. And that doesn't mean just those businesses, but all the people they employ. We have a crisis in housing right now. You and I were just talking about it. I've got businesses calling me saying, I get all of my windows from Canada for the houses that I built. They're the best products that I can get in the Northeast, or I get my lumber from Canada. All of this is going to have inflationary pressure. It's going to make things more expensive for us. And there's so many instances I can point to that Musk in particular does not seem to know exactly what he's doing as he's mucking around in Treasury and Social Security.
We will make mistakes, but we'll act quickly to correct any mistakes.
It's putting our personal, private information at risk. Again, don't care what your political party is. I think you don't want somebody like Musk who has business interests mucking around in our personal information. So I'm very clear that I do represent every single Vermonter.
Back home in Montpelier, Vermonters are watching Republicans and Democrats trying to work together to solve the problems that are facing our people. And I'm concerned that Ballant's identity is too wrapped up in her political ideology for her to ever be willing or able to successfully reach across the aisle with any Republicans to address issues of affordability, public safety, housing, and a host of other issues. Instead of a parade of complaints, many Republicans would like to see her finding issues where Vermonters are in agreement with the new administration. And I think there's a couple opportunities. I think there's a renewed focus on healthy foods, and that's something that Vermont is known for, that Vermonters see as part of our identity, something that I think Secretary Kennedy is bringing into the administration. That's an area of common agreement.
And I'm going to hold this administration to its word. They said they were going to stand up for regular people. They said they were going to bring the prices of goods and services down. That's not what we're seeing right now. They said that they were going to make sure that people had an even playing field. Well, let's talk about the fact that they said they were going to cap interest rates on credit cards. There's been no talk of that. Let's talk about the fact they said they were going to partner to build more housing. Haven't heard anything about that. So what they have shown us is, in fact, not looking out for the people who elected them, but instead, I fear for the billionaires who supported them in their run for the White House. It's very concerning to me.
When Balint returns to Washington, the clock will be ticking on the next potential government shutdown. Lawmakers will have to pass a new budget or a budget extension by mid-March to avoid a lapse in funding.